He sat on the corner of a busy city street, his back pressed against the cold stone wall of a department store that no longer noticed him. The noise of cars, hurried footsteps, and snippets of laughter from passers-by filled the air. But for him, all of it was distant, like echoes in a world he was only half a part of. His clothes were worn, his shoes torn at the seams, and the blanket he carried was thin against the biting wind that seeped through every gap. In his pocket, crumpled and damp from his own sweat and the misty weather, was $8. To anyone else, it was almost nothing, barely enough for a sandwich and coffee, but to him it was everything he had left. It was survival for a day or two, the difference between an empty stomach and the comfort of a warm meal. He had guarded it carefully, telling himself he wouldn't touch it unless absolutely necessary, because once it was gone, there would be nothing left to fall back on. As people rushed past him, most avoiding eye contact, he thought about how invisible he had become. Nobody stopped to ask his name, or to listen to the story that had landed him here. He remembered once being proud, once having a life where a warm bed and steady meals were normal, but that was a past chapter buried under the weight of hardship. Now, every day was a battle with hunger, cold, and the constant ache of being unseen. That $8 was not just money, it was hope. A fragile reminder that he had not yet lost all control. It was late in the afternoon, when he noticed a man not far from where he sat. The man was well dressed, but oddly out of place. His shoes were polished, yet he stood on the sidewalk looking uncertain, patting his coat as if searching for something he couldn't find. He looked frustrated, almost embarrassed, and eventually sat down on the edge of the curb, burying his face in his hands. The homeless man watched him closely, curiosity stirring in his chest. Usually, it was he who felt that defeated, he who carried that weight. To see someone else looking so lost in the middle of a city that never stopped moving was unusual. Minutes passed, and the stranger finally pulled out his phone, tapping it in vain. He shook his head and muttered to himself. From the bits and pieces the homeless man overheard, it sounded like his wallet had been stolen, his phone was dying, and he had no cash to get home. The man looked around, clearly debating whether to approach someone, but everyone walked past him without pause. No one cared to notice, just as they never cared to notice the one sitting against the wall. The homeless man felt a war within himself. He had $8, just 8, and once it was gone, so was his safety net. But as he looked at the stranger, he saw not just a man in need, but a mirror of his own helplessness. He knew what it was like to be desperate, to be stranded without anyone willing to lend a hand. Slowly, almost against his own instincts, he pushed himself up and walked toward the man. His steps were hesitant, his heart heavy with the weight of his choice. "Hey," he said softly, his voice raspy from days of cold air and little water. The stranger looked up, surprised, and for a moment, their eyes locked. The homeless man held out his hand with the crumpled bills. "It's not much, but maybe it'll help you get home." The stranger blinked, taken aback. He glanced at the bills, then at the man offering them, and shook his head. "I can't take that from you," he said firmly. But his eyes softened with a hint of gratitude. "You need it more than I do right now." The homeless man insisted. His stomach growled, betraying his hunger, but he forced himself to smile. "I know what it's like to have nothing. Take it, please." For a long moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the hum of traffic. The stranger hesitated, clearly torn, but finally reached out and accepted the money with trembling hands. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with something more than relief. "You have no idea what this means." The homeless man shrugged, trying to make light of it, even as he felt the sting of sacrifice. "Just pay it forward someday," he said, and with that, he turned and walked back to his spot against the wall, curling his blanket tighter around himself. His stomach twisted with hunger, and he tried not to think about what he had just given up. But deep down, a small warmth flickered, one that came not from food or money, but from the act itself. He had chosen kindness when he had nothing to give, and in that moment, he felt human again, visible in a way that people's passing stares never made him feel. The stranger remained on the curb for a long time, holding the crumpled bills as if they carried more weight than their small value. He watched the homeless man settle back into the shadows, unnoticed by the world, and something inside him shifted. It wasn't just the money, it was the sacrifice behind it. He had been helped countless times in his life, but never like this, never by someone who had so little to spare. He tucked the bills safely into his pocket and rose to his feet, his expression unreadable, a mixture of gratitude, guilt, and admiration. As the evening lights flickered on across the city, the homeless man closed his eyes, his body weary, but his heart strangely lighter. He had no idea who the man truly was. No idea that the act of giving his last $8 would ripple into something far greater than he could ever imagine. All he knew was that, in that brief exchange, he had made a choice that defined him not by what he lacked, but by what he was willing to give. The man who had accepted the crumpled $8 sat quietly with the bills in his hand, almost as if afraid to unfold them. To any ordinary passerby, he looked like just another businessman down on his luck for a moment. But inside his mind there was a storm of thoughts. He was not just any man stranded without a wallet. He was a billionaire, one whose name appeared in financial magazines, whose signature could move markets, whose face was sometimes recognized on the covers of business journals, though not always on the street. He had been moving discreetly through the city, without his usual entourage, wanting a day of solitude and reflection, a day to feel anonymous again. But in that moment of vulnerability, robbed of his wallet and stranded without cash, he had experienced a glimpse of helplessness, and it was there, at his lowest, that someone he least expected had reached out. The irony was not lost on him. He was worth billions. But at that corner, on that day, he was the one in need. And it was not a board member, not a business partner, not even a friend, who stepped in. It was a man with nothing but tattered clothes, an empty stomach, and only $8 to his name. The billionaire stared at the bills in his palm, running his fingers over the worn edges. He felt the weight of sacrifice more than the weight of currency, and it unsettled him in a way profits and losses never could. He thought back to the boardroom meetings he had chaired, where numbers in the millions were tossed around casually, as if they were simple figures rather than lives. He thought of the deals struck over dinner tables, where wasteful amounts of food were left untouched while others outside begged for scraps. He thought of the speeches he had given about innovation, growth, and opportunity. And now, here was a man stripped of all opportunity, still choosing generosity over self-preservation. When the homeless man walked back to his corner, the billionaire couldn't bring himself to leave immediately. He watched him settle down again, watched how people continued to pass by without glancing at him, watched how invisibility had become his daily companion. The billionaire realized that while he had spoken often of risk in financial terms, he had rarely considered the risks of human kindness, the willingness to give without guarantee of return. That homeless man had risked his own comfort, his own fragile safety net, to help someone he thought was a stranger in greater need. The billionaire stood up slowly, slipping the bills into his pocket. He knew he couldn't reveal himself right then, not while emotions were raw. He needed to process this act before deciding how to respond. So he walked away into the crowd, blending in once again with the anonymity he had craved. But unlike before, when he had walked the streets with casual indifference, this time he walked with the weight of realization pressing on his shoulders. All evening, his mind returned to that corner, to the rough face and weathered hands of the man who had helped him. He replayed the moment in his head, hearing again the soft, raspy voice saying, "You need it more than I do right now." The billionaire asked himself whether he could ever have said those words if their roles were reversed. He had given generously to charities in the past, donated to causes that looked good on paper, but none of it carried the raw humanity of what he had just experienced. His giving had always come from excess, never from need. But here was a man who gave out of sacrifice. The billionaire spent the night in his penthouse, surrounded by the luxury he often took for granted. The tall windows overlooked the city, lights glittering like jewels across the skyline, and yet all he could think about was the man on the street who had wrapped himself in a thin blanket against the cold. He thought about the taste of hot meals waiting in his private kitchen, compared to the hunger gnawing at the belly of the man who had saved him. He thought about the softness of his mattress while another man curled up on concrete. It was a discomfort he couldn't shake, and for the first time in years he felt restless in his own wealth. The next morning, he made a decision. He couldn't let this pass as just an unusual encounter or a momentary story to tell at a dinner party. He needed to act, not just in words but in tangible change. He instructed his driver to return him to that same corner, but this time he came prepared. He wasn't dressed in his usual tailored suit but in something simple, wanting to approach the man not as a symbol of wealth but as another human being. When he arrived, he saw him again, sitting quietly in the same place, his face weary but calm, as though the sacrifice of the day before had not shaken him. The billionaire walked closer, his heart thudding as he rehearsed what to say, how to bridge the gap between their worlds. The homeless man looked up, recognition flickering across his eyes, perhaps surprised that the stranger he had helped had returned. "You gave me more than money yesterday," the billionaire began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "You gave me a lesson I'll never forget." The homeless man tilted his head, not fully understanding. To him, it had been a simple act of kindness, one he might not even have thought about again had the man not returned. But the billionaire continued, reaching into his coat and pulling out something the other man could not have imagined. It was not just the crumpled bills returned, but an envelope, thick with papers inside. The billionaire handed it to him, watching the confusion and disbelief spread across his face. "Inside is a chance," he explained softly, "a chance for you to start again. Housing, work, support, everything you need to get back on your feet. Because no one who can give as selflessly as you did should be left to vanish on a sidewalk." The homeless man's hands trembled as he held the envelope, still unsure if this was real, still afraid that it was some cruel trick, but the billionaire's eyes held no mockery, only sincerity. He didn't reveal his identity, not yet, because he didn't want the gesture to feel like charity from a rich man to the poor. He wanted it to feel like recognition, a response to the humanity that had been shown to him when he needed it most. That was the truth of it. The billionaire had learned something that billions of dollars could never teach. Wealth alone didn't carry meaning until it was used to honor the dignity of others, and that man on the street had reminded him of it in the simplest, most powerful way possible. The ripple of one decision can change the course of a life, and for the homeless man who had given away his last $8, That truth was about to unfold in ways he could not have imagined. After the billionaire revealed himself and extended a helping hand, the world he knew's endless cycle of cold nights, hunger, and invisibility began to shift. At first it was difficult for him to believe that any of it was real. He had lived too long in a world where promises dissolved into empty air, where hope often led to disappointment. But this time, things were different. The billionaire, moved by the selflessness of the man's act, had quietly set things in motion. Within days, arrangements were made for temporary housing in a clean, safe place where the homeless man could sleep without fear of being robbed or harassed. The room wasn't grand, but to him, it felt like a palace. A real bed replaced the hard concrete he had known, and the warmth of blankets wrapped around him like an embrace he had long forgotten. For the first time in years, he woke up to the sound of quiet rather than the constant hum of the city streets. He looked around in disbelief every morning, half expecting it to vanish. But it did not vanish. Instead, each day brought something new. The billionaire had also arranged for meals to be delivered until the man could find his footing. Plates of warm food filled his stomach in ways he had almost forgotten were possible. Every bite reminded him of the small kindness he had given on that street corner. The act that had seemed so small but had carried such enormous weight. He thought often about that decision, about how easily he could have clung to the money for himself, how instinct and fear could have convinced him to guard it. But instead, he had given it away, and in return, the world had opened up to him. The billionaire did not stop at food and shelter. He wanted transformation, not temporary relief. He knew that the greatest gift he could offer was not money alone, but opportunity, and so he arranged for the man to meet with mentors, people who could help him rediscover skills, rebuild confidence, and find work that suited him. The homeless man, once an overlooked figure on the sidewalk, began sitting across from people who asked him about his goals, his talents, and his dreams. At first, the questions startled him. Dreams were a luxury he had buried long ago. But slowly, memories surfaced. He had once worked with his hands, skilled in carpentry, able to shape wood into something useful and beautiful. The billionaire listened when the man spoke of this, and within weeks, he had connected him to a small workshop eager to take him in. The owner of the shop, aware of the man's background, was patient and encouraging, offering him simple tasks at first, then gradually more responsibility. His hands, once stiff from cold and hunger, regained their strength as they carved, sanded, and built again. Every creation became more than just a piece of furniture. It became a testament to his journey, proof that dignity could be restored. Word began to spread. The story of the homeless man who had given away his last $8 began to circulate quietly at first, whispered among those who knew the billionaire. Eventually, it caught the attention of local reporters, then national outlets. Headlines appeared, a small act of kindness that changed a life forever. Cameras and microphones followed, but the man himself remained humble. When asked why he gave away his last money, his answer was always simple: because someone needed it more than me. The billionaire eventually revealed his identity, not to bask in attention, but to highlight the importance of the moment. He told audiences that he had been the one in need that day, and the man with nothing had given him everything. It wasn't just $8, he explained. It was humanity. It was sacrifice. And it reminded me of what real wealth means. His words struck chords with people across the world. Business leaders, politicians, and everyday citizens found themselves inspired, rethinking the way they viewed generosity. Donations to shelters surged. Programs to help the homeless gained momentum. People who had once walked past those on the streets without a second glance began stopping, talking, offering help. The homeless man's story had become a beacon, showing that kindness could not only change one life but ignite change in countless others. He became a symbol, not because he sought fame, but because his simple act revealed the depth of humanity that often goes unnoticed. For the man himself, the changes were profound, yet grounding. He moved from temporary housing into a small apartment of his own, a space he could call home. The workshop job grew into a career, his craftsmanship earning recognition and orders from customers who admired not just his skill but his resilience. Slowly, the pieces of his life that had shattered were mended, not perfectly, but strongly enough to hold. He began reconnecting with family he had lost touch with, rebuilding bridges long thought burned. The billionaire remained in his life, not as a savior, but as a friend. They shared conversations about life, about what it meant to give, about how perspective changes when you've known both abundance and scarcity. Their bond was not built on wealth or need, but on the shared moment when one man had chosen to see another's struggle. The transformation was not just material but spiritual. The homeless man discovered a renewed sense of purpose. He began speaking at community centers and schools, telling his story not to seek applause but to encourage others to believe in the power of kindness. He told young people that it wasn't wealth or status that defined a person, but the choices they made when no one was watching. He reminded them that generosity is never wasted, even when it seems small. The billionaire's life also changed. He shifted his focus, investing not just in companies and markets but in people, in programs designed to uplift the forgotten and unseen. He credited the homeless man with opening his eyes, with teaching him a lesson that no boardroom could. He often said that it was easy to give when you had plenty, But the true definition of generosity was giving when you had little. Together, their lives became intertwined in a story retold again and again, a reminder that greatness is not measured in bank accounts or titles, but in the courage to give when giving costs the most. For the man who had once been invisible, life had transformed not because he had sought fortune, but because he had acted out of compassion. And for the billionaire who had once thought he understood the world, life had transformed because he had been reminded of the simplest, most powerful truth that kindness is the one currency that never loses its value.